All right, perfect. Thank you so much. And in particular, thanks to Chapman for the support. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the speakers. Really enjoyed the talks and discussion so far. As Uri mentioned, the topic of this talk is the circuit concept in neuroscience, causation, constraints, and computation. This is joint work with Jim Woodward. In the neuroscience literature and philosophy of neuroscience, there is, of course, a significant amount of attention paid to causation and explanation. We've seen this already in a number of the talks today. At least one main reason for this, of course, is that causes are thought to be an important type of thing to get information about when giving explanations about the world, and the brain is no exception. Causes are factors that explain their effects. A main question of interest in this space, given this connection, is in being able to specify the types of causes and the types of causal structures that are present in the brain that neuroscientists study and that should figure and that do figure in the explanations that they provide. In the philosophy of neuroscience literature, among the causal terms, concepts, and words that receive attention, as you probably already know, there's one that stands out among all of the others. The notion of mechanism, the concept of a mechanism, receives a massive amount of attention in philosophy of neuroscience. So much so that philosophers in this space suggest that this is in fact the main type of causality. And can someone ask the speaker to get closer to the mic? Yeah. All right. So the dominant view in philosophy of neuroscience I think I'm closer now. Happy to get feedback. Tell me if I'm too close. In philosophy of neuroscience, also philosophy of biology, the dominant view for at least the last 2 decades has been that most, if not all, types of explanations that neuroscientists and biologists provide are mechanistic, right? That their explanations always require that they're appealing to and citing a mechanism. Also that this is the main type of causality in these scientific domains. We don't have to go back to 17th century mechanical philosophies to see this. We see it in more recent work from Herbert Simon, Bill Wimsatt, where there's significant attention to and focus on mechanisms, where this is often a term that refers to a kind of causal system with hierarchical organization. Here, lower level causal parts that interact in some way to produce a higher level outcome of a system. And of course, the most recently, this new mechanist approach, which is supported by work that is done by Carl Craver, Bechtel, Darden, many others in this space, that is identifying different types of mechanistic explanations in neuroscience and in biology. A main challenge among those that have been raised for this new mechanist approach in programs is that, of course, mechanism means very different things to different people. We see this very much being the case in the context of philosophy. At least one main division among notions of mechanism is that a kind of earlier traditional and maybe the standard notion is more narrow, where mechanism is used to refer to very particular types of causal systems. Typically systems, as mentioned, that are hierarchical. They have lower level causal parts. They're often in close spatial proximity. They interact to produce a higher level outcome of the system. That's a more narrow notion. Now, there's a much broader notion of mechanism that has become far more popular, where it really refers to almost any type of causal system and set of causes that work together. So there's this more narrow and more expansive or broad notion of mechanism that we see in the philosophical literature. Of course, this can be a bit challenging because then what it means to say that we have mechanistic explanation depends on how we've defined mechanism in the first place. This isn't just a semantic issue. The term mechanism in these contexts is referring to concrete, actual, distinct types of causes and causal systems in the world, and it's important to unpack what these are. And it isn't just the case that we see different notions of mechanism in philosophy. Danny Bassett and I recently wrote a paper where we examined the notion of mechanism in neuroscience and identified that it's also the case that this is a term, a causal term, that is used to refer to different types of causal systems in neuroscience. It's a term that's used in different ways. This is interesting because mechanism is a status term in neuroscience, right? And it means different things to different people. So if we look at the terminology found in guidelines for grants, NSF, NIH, in terms of what they're going to fund, if we look at guidelines for top journals in neuroscience, what we see in both of these guidelines explicitly stated is that research is going to be funded and research is going to be published if mechanisms have been identified and if the work is providing mechanistic insights. Now, once that's kind of stated in these guidelines, the editors very quickly mentioned that they can't be precise on exactly what counts as a mechanism. And it's also the case that when we have different researchers looking at the same paper or the same grant application, they completely disagree on whether it's providing mechanistic insights or not, right? So a very interesting situation where we have status term for the field, right? This is viewed as a kind of high quality gold standard type of causality, causal structure, but there isn't agreement on exactly what it refers to or exactly what kind of causal system a mechanism is. One way to move forward in this space is to focus on and to clarify what Woodward has referred to as distinctions within causation. Whether we want to use mechanism in a broad way or a narrow way, what we need is to be able to distinguish different types of causes and causal systems from one another, right? No matter what we want to call them. There are very different types of features that show up across different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems. These matter for the explanations we provide, the types of control those factors and systems provide over their effects and over the world, and the different ways that scientists study these systems as well. One thing that kind of nicely indicates that there are distinctions within causation, causal varieties, is the sense in which we see different causal terms being used by scientists in this domain and in many others, right? We have scientists referring to causes that are probabilistic versus deterministic, causes that are structuring versus triggering, proximal, distal, and so on. In fact, one of the main motivations for these new mechanistic counts of explanation in neuroscience is the fact that neuroscientists very often use the word mechanism. This motivated a lot of this philosophical work. Now, what's interesting is that there are, of course, many other causal terms and concepts that neuroscientists very frequently use. We've heard many of them in the talks today. Terms like pathways, cascades, and a central concept that's showing up more and more recently in neuroscience is the notion of a circuit. Now, the notion of a circuit isn't a causal term that we see showing up in remote parts of neuroscience and infrequently being cited. This is a causal term that is referring to a kind of causal system in this field that is viewed as revolutionizing neuroscience, as bringing neuroscience closer to causality, as bridging levels, often lower level molecular detail with higher level cognitive outcomes. We see references to circuit disorders. In the wonderful talk by Mike Yassa earlier today, we had him refer, quote, to the dysfunction happening at the level of the circuit. So it's very common to see reference to circuits in discussing different types of disorders and being able to kind of bridge lower levels and higher levels. There are different types of methods and techniques that neuroscientists use to intervene on and manipulate circuits. Of course, optogenetics is one nice example of this. These techniques, it's suggested, are better able to explain complex brain behaviors, right? So the causal notion of a circuit is referring to a system that is viewed as kind of special, new, something that's revolutionizing neuroscience. In the talk today, part of what we're going to discuss and provide an analysis of is this notion of circuit in neuroscience, answering the question, what kind of causal system is a circuit in this domain? What are the features of a causal system? when it's referred to as a circuit? And what are the implications of this for explanation, causal standards in neuroscience, for the methods that scientists use to study these systems, and for causal communication? So the plan for the rest of this talk today takes 4 main steps. First, what I'll do is I'll give some circuit examples, primarily from neuroscience, but from other domains as well. I'm going to make some suggestions about how to understand circuits as causal systems, essentially what their main features are and what their unique features are. Also, of course, how they differ from other types of causal systems that are not circuits. I'll discuss briefly circuit manipulations, various types of strategies that are used to intervene on and manipulate circuits and some of the challenges that they face. And then at the very end, I'll suggest some implications that this analysis has for understanding causal systems in this domain and causal explanation. So starting things off with circuit examples. The notion of a circuit, interestingly, shows up in many different scientific fields. We're focusing here primarily on neuroscience, and there are many nice examples of this causal concept. A first class of examples are simple circuits, reflex circuits, where we often have some kind of input that can be a noxious stimuli that is very quickly producing some kind of outcome or behavior, often more automatic, often more spontaneous. This is the cross-extensor reflex, essentially referring to a situation where if there's a noxious stimuli that we step on with one foot, there's this very quick automatic response where we lift that foot up off of like a nail, for example, and the muscles on the opposing side of the body contract so that we can stabilize ourselves. We can think of other reflex circuits that are similar to this, like your hands getting close to hot fire, something hot, and you very quickly pull it back, startle response, and many others. These are happening on very short time scales. They involve this kind of input, output behavior. Simple reflex circuits. Another class of circuits involve more complex brain outcomes and behaviors. These are circuits that are involved in producing behaviors like memory, fear response, many other types of more complex outcomes. These are circuits that involve processing on much longer timescales, and they also involve a kind of input-output, a set of connections along which there is computational or signal processing. Traditional example that often shows up in this space is the prey capture circuit in frogs. And another nice class of examples are smaller scale circuits, microcircuits, sometimes called iconic circuits, where here there is a focus on capturing causal patterns among single neurons or smaller nerve tracts. And as we can see, attention to the very particular type of pattern in which neurons are connected up. There are, of course, different names for these connection patterns. Feed-forward loops, parallel processing, and so on. Another domain in which we also kind of might standardly think of the circuit concept is in engineering context. In fact, you might think that this is one of the main reasons why in neuroscience these particular causal systems are referred to as circuits, because they're analogized to circuits that we find in electronic context, computer science context. Here where we have electronic circuits, synthetic circuits, where there is, again, a kind of fixed set of connections, often referred to as wiring diagrams, which is, of course, another term that's used to refer to neural circuits in the particular illustrations that are used to show their connections. What's interesting is that outside of this neuroscience and engineering set of contexts, we also see the circuit concept used in areas of biology that are different from these kind of neuroscience domains. The circuit concept shows up in many different areas of biology, often more systems biology and computational biology, often referred to as circuit motifs. We see these circuits in the context of molecular, cellular circuits, circuits in hormonal physiology contexts and immunology contexts. There is a fantastic book and lots of literature by Uri Alon that discusses, very much studies, and introduces all of these different circuit motifs and circuit types in the context of these biological cases. Similar to our smaller microcircuits in neuroscience, these involve connection patterns across very explicit kind of causal variables in a system, often in gene expression context, production of hormones, and they have unique names as well. Feed-forward loop, single input system, feedback loops, you name it. So a nice kind of set of cases where we're seeing the use of this circuit concept showing up in different domains. If we look across these different domains, we see some similarities across the systems that are referred to as circuits. First, very obviously, in these systems, there is an emphasis on the connections across elements in the system, right? Referred to as wiring diagrams, particular names that are used to specify a particular connection pattern across elements in the system. It's also the case that these causal representations and illustrations are very abstract. There is a large amount of lower level detail that's not showing up in these systems at all. We have no detail about ion channels, about ions. We're getting a much more kind of higher level representation of causal elements in the system. And a third unique feature that's showing up in these causal systems is, of course, an emphasis on the flow of a kind of signal through the system and along these different connections, often referred to as a kind of computation that's taking place across circuits in all of these different domains. So part of what I'm going to suggest in this talk is that circuits in neuroscience are causal systems that often have four main features. A first feature of these systems is that they have a kind of fixed structural or anatomical connectivity. A second feature of these systems is that they involve some kind of flow or processing of signals. This is being constrained, interestingly, by that fixed anatomical connectivity. So the structural or anatomical connectivity is operating as a kind of constraint on this signal processing, this information flow. With respect to the connectivity in the circuit, there is a focus on mapping that. Of course, that is much more easily represented in these diagrams, referred to often as wiring diagrams. When it comes to this flow of information or processing of signals, this is often, of course, referred to as kind of computational states of the system, how a signal is being processed through the system. And what I'll do in the next slide is I'll spend more time on these first two features of circuits because I think these are well understood as different types of causal elements of these systems. But here, I'll mention a third and fourth feature of circuits. Third, there is very much a mesoscale focus of circuits. What I mean by this is that these are causal systems that are not reductive. The standard way of thinking about mechanisms is that they're highly reductive. You've got a lot of lower level detail, and you need that, and you need information about how all of those causal parts are working together. Circuits don't have that kind of lower level detail, and the suggestion is you don't need it to give the kind of explanation that these are able to give. So here, a causal system that is much more mesoscale and that doesn't have the reductive character of the traditional mechanism that we're used to. A fourth main feature of these circuits in neuroscience is they have a functional focus. We don't see this with all types of causal systems in the life sciences. These circuits are producing an outcome or behavior that has a purpose. There's a kind of goal that it's serving, and we see this in almost all of the examples, often relating to the kind of input-output of the system, where the system is producing an output given an input, and it's functional for this system, right? With our reflex circuits, there's a very good reason why we need to pull back our hand when there's a hot source, and same with a noxious stimuli. There's also, kind of related to this functional focus, a sense in which the explanatory target is just so much more complex for circuits. There are many causal systems in the life sciences that are hooked up to explanatory targets that are quite simple, right? If you want to explain eye color in a fruit fly, the height of a plant, these are far easier than these more complex cognitive behaviors that we see as the kind of output explanatory target of circuits. What's interesting is when we pin down these four features, we see that they're similar to and shared with the other circuit examples. We see that the circuit concept in neuroscience in many ways is analogous to the circuit concept in these other domains. Circuits in computer science also have this kind of fixed structural connectivity, fixed circuitry. Of course, they're very much involving computation, processing, functioning to do something. These circuit motifs in the systems biology context also share these features in really interesting ways, right? Examples were these gene expression circuit motifs and hormonal circuits. One of the things that you see systems biologists indicate when they discuss these circuit motifs is that you need two main things to be able to explain their behavior. You need an understanding of the structural topology, and then you need to know the dynamics or the flow on top of that. You need both of those pieces in order to explain the complex behavior. Very interesting because that's similar to this fixed structural anatomical connectivity and then that flow or processing of signals. Those are two very distinct types of causal elements in these systems. Interesting also, of course, because the outputs of these seemingly very simple circuit motifs are incredibly complex. These are far more complicated than a kind of standard effect that we sometimes focus on in philosophy of science. Examples of different types of complex outcomes that these circuit motifs produce are things like sign-sensitive delay, temporal expression, and oscillations. They're often referred to as processing a kind of computational task. So we also see this similarity in referring to these causal systems as involving something computational, right, which we just don't see for all types or any type of causal system. What I'll do now is spend a little bit more time on these first two elements of the circuit concept, structural connectivity and the processing of signals. I think it makes sense to think of these as capturing distinct types of causes in these systems. Structural connectivity can be well understood as a kind of structural cause, also referred to as a causal constraint. Both Jim and myself have work on what it means for something to be a structural cause and causal constraints. In this case, our structural cause is constraining the flow of a signal moving through the system. The processing of signals, I think, is a causal element that is understood as a kind of computational cause. As a way to introduce a model for starting to think about these different types of causes, consider a case that was discussed by D.Sc, the philosopher, in his book, Explaining the Brain, which I think helpfully distinguishes these two types of causes. D.Sc gives us an example where we have a light switch, and we have two downstream systems, or sorry, we have a switch. It doesn't need to be a light switch. We have two downstream systems from this switch. We have a light that can be on or off, and we have a bell that can ring or be silent. There is a wire that is connecting up our switch to one of these systems versus the other. D.Sc refers to the switch as a triggering cause, and he refers to the wire as a structuring cause. Both of these elements are causes in the sense that if you were to intervene on them, they give you control about something and over something in these systems. The structuring cause is going to give you control over the possibility space of the system, basically what it's possible to turn on, right, and what it's not possible to turn on. The triggering cause is a causal factor that gives you control over when a given system turns on or off. The structuring cause gives you control over which one turns on or off. Is it going to be the light? Is it going to be the bell? The structuring cause is something that is guiding, constraining, and channeling, in this case, the flow of electricity, right? And it's something that is explaining a kind of different feature of the system and a different kind of explanatory target. The possibility space, right? What it's possible to turn on with our triggering cause, and also what it's impossible to turn on. This is related to discussions of constraints in philosophy of science. There are really fascinating discussions of constraints in philosophy of physics, where they're viewed as providing impossibility explanations. We can see that a little bit here in the sense that our structuring cause can allow us to explain why in this system it's impossible to turn on the bell, right? So a kind of interesting difference between these two types of causes that we can unpack in a bit more detail. Our structural cause is a causal factor that is constraining another type of element in the system. In these cases, it's constraining the flow of a signal. And our structural cause in operating as a constraint is something that is guiding, channeling, and kind of dictating, in this case, the flow of signaling through the system. It's often something that is viewed as external to the object that it constrains. It's viewed as much more fixed than our computational cause, right? We often think of the wiring diagrams as capturing a kind of causal structure that is changing on a much longer time scale, and same with our neural circuits. The anatomical connectivity is something that we think of as relatively fixed in the sense that it's changing on longer time scales and often harder to change than the other type of cause, which in this case is well understood as a kind of computational cause. Capturing information flow, processing through the system. There is a lot more, of course, that needs to be said about how exactly to understand the kind of computational intermediates and nature of circuits. The suggestion here is that you need both of these causal factors. This is part of a kind of ensemble. These are interacting causes in producing the downstream outcomes of these systems. Of course, there are lots of open questions about how exactly to well understand all of the details and complexities involved in the computational processing of these systems, right? Questions about the physiological neural code that are still viewed as open in the context of neuroscience. A first step into thinking about this type of computational cause is to think about computational states and how earlier states in the system are causally influencing later computational states in the system. There are notions of causal specificity that I think will be helpful here in thinking about information flow through a system. The notion of causal specificity is often one that is thought to capture certain types of information in the context of the life sciences, but there is a lot more that needs to be said, and so much more to unpack with respect to kind of capturing the computational character of these systems, how to understand it, how to capture it causally and explanatorily. The suggestion here is that we can start to distinguish different types of causes in these systems that are separate from each other. They are playing different types of explanatory roles in these systems. They're also studied in different types of ways, right? DTI is going to be used, and tracers are often going to be used to identify that kind of map of anatomical connections in a system. And then, as we'll see, optogenetics is something that is manipulating, intervening on something else, the activity of the neuron, the information. So the suggestion here, there are at least these four main features that are characteristic of and that we find in these circuits in neuroscience. We've heard of mechanism coming up quite a bit, of course, and one of the notions of mechanism that was discussed earlier is this very broad notion, where it sort of refers to any type of causal system in a more narrow notion, more traditional, where it's a kind of lower level causal process that involves some kind of extreme detail about a causal system. If we think of our more kind of traditional notion of mechanism, where we're thinking of something like a drug's mechanism of action, right, aspirin causing headache relief, we can start to see that there's a lot of clear differences between this notion of mechanism, the kind of causal system here, in the circuits that we're attending to in these neuroscience contexts, right? The mechanism of a drug's action isn't something that we think of as involving fixed or structural anatomical connectivity. We don't often talk about the flow of signals through those causal systems, and they're definitely not mesoscale higher level causal systems. They involve lots of lower level detail. So we're starting to see something different here with the notion of a circuit from our traditional standard notion of a mechanism. If you start to think of other causal systems too that we don't standardly think of as circuits, you see a very similar thing. There are so many different types of causal systems in science and in the world, and relatively few of them have these special features that we see with circuits. So think of things like billiard balls colliding, the causes of car crashes in society, the causes of mountain formation. These are not causal systems that we typically or ever refer to as circuits, and it makes sense why, right? Circuit is a term that is used to refer to causal systems that are probably analogous to circuits in engineering, electronic, and computer science contexts, right? And causal systems that have these types of features. And some causal systems have these features, but of course all don't. Part of what we're interested in with this type of project is being able to specify different types of causes and causal systems, partly because those differences matter for how scientists study them in the first place. We see this very nicely with tools and methods that are used to study circuits in neuroscience. There are, of course, many different types of methods that are used to get information about and intervene on neural systems in the brain. A common technique that shows up in the context of circuit manipulations, of course, is optogenetics, a technique that has this very interesting history of being suggested in a far-fetched manner by Crick, who was thinking of getting around this challenge of being able to come up with very surgical, precise interventions on particular neurons, and getting around this challenge by using light and light-sensitive ion channels in particular neurons in a given domain. This is the motivation behind and often cited as the kind of origin of the idea of optogenetics techniques, right? Using light to control the activity of neurons through these light-sensitive ion channels. A technique that is very exciting, right? Viewed as one that's at the forefront of untangling causality in these systems. This is well understood as a kind of intervention on the neural signaling and neural activity of these systems, right? Not that fixed anatomical connectivity. It's a technique that provides impressive temporal and spatial resolution, right? And this is something that's highlighted in so many different types of papers and projects on this work. A kind of paradigm of a surgical intervention that is bringing neuroscience closer to causality. An impressive type of technique, but one that is still undergoing various types of improvements, and that scientists cite has challenges that are kind of at the forefront of their minds in advancing these types of methods. One challenge that shows up for these optogenetics methods is an interest in performing what are called natural interventions. So you can imagine it's easy to think of, or different to think of intervening on a system in kind of any type of way. What is of interest in the context of optogenetics is performing a kind of intervention that is natural in the sense that it's similar to the types of changes in neural activity that we would find in these systems in natural settings. So there's an interest in using optogenetics to perform interventions that mimic natural changes in the system so that one can represent the kind of physiological neural code that is actually taking place in these systems so that we can explain how they're producing various types of outputs. Obviously, there's challenges that these techniques are not there yet, and there's open questions about how exactly one would go about performing this type of natural intervention and what it is. The second challenge that shows up in the context of these manipulations are challenges that have to do with modularity. These techniques often involve assumptions about modularity in the sense that when a scientist is intervening on a candidate cause in these systems, that intervention on the cause will have effects on variables that are causally downstream of X, but it shouldn't affect other variables. In other words, the intervention is something that shouldn't lead the whole system to reorganize, and there are kind of concerns about whether or not these modularity assumptions hold for these techniques. This is something that we would need to be in place in order to directly learn from these types of interventions. A third challenge for optogenetics techniques is that the outcome of interest in these cases, the explanatory target, is extremely complex. It's far more complicated than standard or many types of explanatory targets and effects that are studied in different domains in the life sciences, right? Some of the complex kind of cognitive and effect variables of interest in this space are things like anxiety, fear, memory, even disease phenotypes that involve many different variables. These are harder to define, identify, and measure when you compare them to other types of traits, right? Like the height of a plant, things like blood pressure, and more kind of variables that are just far more simple to measure. And of course, if this is being done in animal models, then right, it's pretty kind of straightforward to see the challenges with being able to get a kind of well-defined explanatory target or effect variable in these systems. What are some of the implications of this analysis? Part of what we're interested in this type of work is to capture the methods that scientists use to study causal systems. And these methods are going to differ depending on the types of causes and the types of causal systems that are out there in the world that scientists are engaging with. Essentially, different types of causal systems have different features, and these features often dictate that some methods can or can't be used, and they require different types of methods. So one example is the sense in which different methods are going to give us information about the anatomical connectivity in a system, where others are going to give us information about the kind of neural activity and differences in kind of signal processing through the system. This work also has implications for specifying and gaining clarity on the causal standards in science, right? As was mentioned earlier, in grant calls and journal guidelines that are present in neuroscience, there are explicit specifications that if research is going to be funded, if research is going to be published, that the scientists need to both identify mechanisms and provide mechanistic insights. We wouldn't want this kind of language and this specification of the standards to exclude research on circuits, on mesoscale causes, on structural causes, on dynamical systems models, computational models that are representing right, systems in this space. Part of the challenge is that we often lack precise labels for different types of causes and different types of causal systems. And of course, we see this in not just neuroscience, right? Not just biology, but in philosophy as well. We see it discussed by scientists in many cases, right? The sense in which the kind of notion of causality and interpretations of it are kind of ambiguous and very complicated. A lot of the work that I do is focused on clarifying different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems in these scientific domains, and then also providing labels that we can use to distinguish these types of causes, causal relationships and causal systems from each other. So there's a real need for causal clarity here, for work that allows us to capture different types of causation, different types of causal systems. And this is something that philosophers can help with, right? Philosophers who are working with scientists, and right, it's work that matters for all sorts of reasons. A little bit of kind of extra information about distinctions across types of causal systems. So we've heard quite a bit about the mechanism concept in this talk and many others. In the discussion today, we've looked at another causal term that's used to refer to a different type of complex causal system. In other work that I've done, I've suggested that these other types of more complex causal terms refer to distinct types of systems, causal systems in the life sciences. Interestingly, each of these is connected up to a unique analogy. Mechanisms are often analogized to machines. The pathway concept, ecological pathways, developmental pathways, vascular pathways, these are often analogized to the roadway concept, roadways, highways, city streets. Cascades are analogized to the snowball effect or the ripple effect. And circuits here, right, are analogized to circuits in electronics and computer science contexts. So one thing that we can start to do is we can look at these kind of more complex causal systems in neuroscience and across many others and see how they differ from one another, right? And the terms don't matter so much here, unless you care about those analogies, which are somewhat useful. What matters are the actual concrete features of these systems and how they differ from one another. But there are many other types of causation that we can distinguish from one another, and we can kind of order them and organize them into a kind of taxonomy. We can start first at, you might think of as like the most basic kind of level of causality, which is a single causal step. There are many types of differences across causes at this scale. They can differ with respect to speed, material continuity, whether they're transferring material from cause to effect, whether they're reversible or irreversible, their strength, stability, and specificity. If we look at how causes are integrated together, causal integration, there's a whole kind of other set of distinctions that we can make with respect to causal integration. Causal topology involves panning back even more and identifying different ways that causal steps are organized and arranged with respect to each other. This isn't an exhaustive list of all kind of categories for thinking about types of causation in neuroscience or the life sciences, but it's a helpful starting point. There are surely many other types and many other types that I've looked into that aren't listed here. But part of what you can start to see is that these more complex causal systems are often built up out of building blocks where you can start to precisely specify the different types of causality that we're interested in. So if you think of the causal terms that often show up in scientific contexts, things like deterministic or probabilistic causes, necessary or sufficient ones, it's often the case that those terms are used both to refer to different types of things, right? Deterministic causation is used to refer to different things, and sometimes different words are used to refer to the same thing. That makes it really hard to get clarity about causality. Being able to pin down exactly what one means by a deterministic cause, right? I think often one that involves both high strength and stability is a way to start making progress on causal clarity. And, right, kind of the same goes for each of these categories. So a little bit more kind of background on work on these causal distinctions. There's a sense in which Jim Woodward really started this project off with a fantastic paper on different types of causation in biology. There he focused on stability, specificity, and proportionality, and this is a project that kind of extends that in different dimensions. So in conclusion, today I've discussed this circuit concept in the context of neuroscience. I've suggested that It's a causal term that is used to refer to causal systems that often have these four main features. These are systems that are analogized to and similar to circuits in other domains, electronic circuits, biological circuits, interestingly have similar features. There are just tons of new areas that are exciting to look into with respect to this project and lots of related projects. We heard earlier discussions of distinctions between causal and non-causal explanations. This is a book that just came out yesterday that's open access that gives a breakdown of common types of both causal and non-causal explanations in biology, but this is really the life sciences. So the examples are from biology, neuroscience, ecology, and so on. Sometimes non-causal explanations are also called mathematical explanations in philosophy of science. So this is an introduction to different types of scientific explanation, but there's so much more to look into here to move forward the philosophy of neuroscience and the theory of neuroscience. More focus on this mesoscale character of causal systems, an engineering approach, a focus on systems that are non-reductive, that have design elements, function elements that involve computation. Very much a focus on specifying differences across types of causal systems, what their features are, labels that we do use, that we can use to kind of precisely specify those different features. And this is important for all sorts of reasons. It can help guide and clarify discussions about causal standards in neuroscience, how explanations work. They can help provide causal clarity and support science communication, both when scientists are talking to each other, but also when they're communicating their work to the public. Thank you.
Marco.
Thank you very much. So you insisted on the explanatory role of the notion of cause and causality connection. But as philosophers, we should know that if there is a notion that requires explanation, from Aristotle to Hume to Kant to Mach to more recently Jodiah Pearl, is exactly the notion of cause. We don't know what is a cause. So my question is, what is a cause according to you? What distinguishes a cause by a correlation?
A cause is a factor such that if you were to intervene on that factor and that factor alone and manipulate it, it gives you control over an effect. So I think of causation in terms of control. This is consistent with Pearl. This is consistent with Woodward. That's how I think of the definition of causation. The taxonomy doesn't capture the definition. This captures distinctions. I think of these as secondary features of causation. The primary feature, the definition, for me is control. And I think we heard it in many of the talks today, where the evidence you need for causality is evidence about what happens with an intervention.
So the notion of control, according to you, should be explained counterfactually. That is something. Okay, so you have a counterfactual notion, of course.
It's a notion that involves counterfactuals about interventions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Megan, and then Jay, and then Ralph.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. So you started the talk by kind of making this distinction between structural and computational causes, and you used the nice, cute example of the light switch being hooked up to the bulb or to the bell. And then you also talked about some challenges, specifically from the perspective of intervention via optogenetics, where we want to make the patterns that we're inducing physiologically meaningful or relevant or fit within the kind of general distribution of physiological meaningful patterns and the idea of modularity. So I'm like, that's the context of this question, which is there really a distinction then between a structural cause and a computational cause in the context of neuroscience circuits? And where I'm thinking is that if you have the equivalent of the light switch, in a pattern that you're inducing via optogenetics or simply by like physiologically relevant naturalistic stimulation. That's not just going to be constrained by the existing structure of the system, but it might actually cause the system to reorganize. And so this isn't a question of the system can generally reorganize over longer timescales, but is locally stable. It's that the thing that you're calling a computational cause itself messes up or changes the structural cause. So I guess my question is it really fair for us to separate those two types of causes? Or is maybe one nested in a kind of a dependent structure inside the other? And where would such a type of system where the light switch causes the wiring to switch around and maybe hook up to the bell in addition to, where the wiring was before the light switch turned on, where would that kind of dependent system fit in this taxonomy that you conveniently pulled up for the last question?
So I think of this in terms of two questions. The first one involves modularity assumptions. If we don't have those, all bets are off. We can't even talk about causality well, because the interventionist account and these types of techniques demand and require that the system meet some modularity assumptions. So if we don't have that, all bets are off, and that's often assumed in causal representations of systems. And there are concerns that with respect to these techniques, that those aren't met, and that would be a challenge for using them to learn causal information about the system. With respect to the second, I think once they're met, it can be straightforward to specify the difference between the structural cause and the triggering one. I mean, we heard earlier today about differences in connectivity and the sense in which that matters for different types of outcomes, if there's more connectivity or less. If we even just think of it in terms of the causal topologies, part of what we see is that different connection patterns explain different types of behaviors of systems. And so here you can see the structural connectivity of a system playing an explanatory role. That like bow tie structure there in the middle is said to be one that's fragile, in the sense that if you intervene on the node and kind of attack that or target that, the whole system shuts down. That's common in like our immune system. So if instead you had a bypass, you added a connection, it's no longer fragile. So that would be more of a structural explanation, causal topological explanation, where it's the topology and the connection patterns. Or, think of, many lesion experiments rely on who's connected to who in a system. So if, there's a lesion in a certain area of the brain and you know that that's connected to a downstream area, you use that structural connection to give an explanation. If it's connected somewhere else, then you're going to have a pathology in another area. So I think the harder part is the computational aspect and element. But I do think of them as distinct in the sense that we don't think it's enough to just know the connectome or the wiring diagram. We've got to know this kind of extra information about the signal processing. So they often come together for these more complex explanatory targets in neuroscience, where it isn't enough maybe to just have a consideration of differences in topology and differences in kind of connections in the system. What matters is both the connections and then the dynamics on top of that, or the computations on top of that are happening in the system. But the way I would think about it is you can also think of intervening on both of these in a way that keeps them distinct. In order for them to be two separate types of causes, it needs to be possible to change one without, at the same time, changing the other.
So let me push you a little bit more, if I can, and just say, like, in neuroscience specifically, based on what we know about how the brain responds to external stimuli and is dynamic and is constantly evolving and changing, do you think that the assumption of modularity that will allow this kind of causal intervention, this is a very defeatist question, right? Like, is this a fair assumption in neuroscience that we can, in fact, use this distinction between structural causes and computational causes, not just in the context of optogenetics, but in lesion studies and anything? Do you think it's fair to do that in neuroscience?
Well, we should be asking some neuroscientists. So yeah, what I would say is, in some systems, yes, / we're hopeful. And then the other answer is, we really need it in the causal model. That's what matters. So if you can represent the system accurately, adequately, and you have modularity in your model, I think in many cases that's what we care about. And so, two-part answer to a great question.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My question is about this diagram. Everything seems to be unidirectional here, and you know, throughout all of my research, I've always, and Rumelhart also, he got me thinking this way. You know, we've been intrigued with the idea that the causation is reciprocal, right? That all the variables interact with each other and mutually determine their outcome. And so, you know, when you have a diagram of this kind, it makes it look as though it's all just going one way, right? All your arrows are like that, and the only thing that's like that for me is time. I feel like I can be reasonably confident that something I inject in the system at time t did not affect the system prior to time t, but because all the elements of the system are potentially interacting with each other, it potentially affects all of them, and they in turn reflect it at all future times. Mm-hmm. And I just, I wonder to what extent that's part of this whole theorizing that you're doing, mm-hmm. or taxonomizing that you're doing about the nature of causation. Because,
good. Yeah. So I would say that's a challenge that scientists have to deal with, and a way that they get around it is by fixing particular variables of interest in the domain and being very careful about intervening on one and holding others fixed to get information about causality in a set of background conditions. So if they're performing randomized control trials, or if they're performing interventions on drugs in an animal model, they're going to perform an unconfounded experimental manipulation, and they need to get good evidence about causality. So there's tricks they have to handle and deal with the causal complexity of the world, and they need to manage that in order to get good causal information. But of course, these are all relative to particular background conditions and contexts, and we can say, you know, with lots of great evidence that, you know, aspirin is a cause of headache relief, and that's not troubled by the fact that the world is causally complicated in various ways. Scientists are pretty expert at setting up their methods such that they can get very good evidence for causality and make sure that they don't have like a spurious correlation or mirror correlation. And what that involves and what that requires is that they have this very special type of intervention, unconfounded experimental manipulation or intervention. So this is referring to special cases where scientists think they have really good evidence that they have these, and there's kind of lots of complicated challenges that get in their way. It's non-trivial to get evidence for these, but they absolutely have to deal with those types of challenges. But
I was talking about the taxonomy of causation itself. I wasn't talking about the challenge of doing science. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't strike me that taxonomy of causation includes the reciprocity that I was speaking of.
I'm not sure that's a very good one to include. That's probably why. So what do you mean by reciprocity of causation?
Well, if in a dynamical system, at least, you can have multi-stability. You can also have situations where an intervention on one variable will produce an activation of another, which will produce a reciprocal effect back on the first one. So in the interactive activation model of letter perception that I described on the first yesterday morning, the cause of perception of any of how well you perceive any given letter is actually dependent on all of the other letters, how much information you get about them, as well as how much information you get about this letter. And since each letter affects all the other ones, you can't say which one is first, right? They're all mutually determining how well each of them is perceived. And that's just, it's not reflected as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
here.
so we've got feedback loops here,
Where?
causal topology.
That just
The
goes
three variable
forward.
feedback
I looked
loop.
at that. It doesn't.
Well, so but what this does require,
Did you mean to have it go back? I mean, because it doesn't go back. I looked at that little triangle and it's just going forward.
well, so it's going back to variable A if it's A, B, C. But
I don't see that. The arrows are just, see the arrows are going from A.
so this is this feedback loop here.
It doesn't go around.
This goes around.
Wait, it doesn't because the arrows are all pointing.
Oh, sorry. That's actually a mistake then. Sorry.
That was my question.
Ah, okay.
Well,
Feedback loop. So I'm happy with sorry, that arrow should be, that's
Okay, that helps.
I'm happy with feedback loops, but if you have, at the same, so with A causes B and B causes A, I think that gets a little more tricky, and this framework does put us in a position to probably like fix the time scale of interest, so you really are paying attention to one direction at a time. But yeah, we'll fix this.
Okay, thank you.
We have to stop here.
That clarifies my question.
Okay, good.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here, so the rest of the questions, yeah, but I'll give you time at the end of the session. So now, the next talk will be by Frederick Eberhardt.